Hello, everyone. Welcome back to OneTAKE Live. I'm your host, Ian Barkin. And for those who aren't familiar, OneTAKE is an opportunity for me to speak to leaders, visionaries, and game changers about the future of work, life, and culture. And because it's 2020, I want to start by saying I hope everyone who is tuning in is safe, is healthy, and also want to reaffirm, and I've started saying this in all the shows, that this vision, this personal mental image I have of the future of work, life, and culture is always a future in which equality, opportunity, fairness are inherent in that future. So excited to explore today a topic that everybody is talking about, and that topic is digital transformation. So without further ado, I could not be more thrilled to welcome my next guest, Peter High, who is the founder and CEO of Metis Strategy. Peter, welcome to OneTAKE.
Ian, it's a pleasure. Great to see you as always. Thanks for including me.
It's great to have you. And over the course of this discussion, we will unpick how you and I know each other and some of our background together. And I promise none of it is contentious or scary.
That'll require a lot of editing then.
Exactly. Sorry, one take. It's all in here. It just goes like. And I will remind all those folks who've tuned in, please let us know who you are, where you're tuning in from, share your name, your location, and also get those questions ready. I know you'll have some, and we'd be thrilled to try to answer them throughout the course of this discussion. So, Peter, and I'll mention this a little bit later on, but you are an absolute star at podcasts, and I imagine in podcasts you get to sort of post-produce this introduction. But in this case, I just make you awkwardly sit there as I talk about you. So here it goes. So one of the reasons I'm so thrilled to have Peter on OneTAKE is Peter has been a prolific thinker, visionary, writer, teacher on the topic of digital transformation and IT strategy and innovation. Beyond simply founding Metis Strategy, which is an organization that works in the intersection of business and technology disciplines. He's also written 2 books. His first book was World Class IT, Why Businesses Succeed When IT Triumphs. And the second book called Implementing World Class IT Strategy, How It Can Drive Organizational Innovation. And if that's not enough, he's also a columnist for Forbes. His column's called Technovation. And if you're already asking how the heck does he find all the time, he does one more, and he has an extraordinary podcast that's been running for years and years and years called Technovation with Peter High. We'll put all of those links in the show notes because they are a must see, must read, must watch. Because this introduction just must keep going to fairly represent all that you've done. Peter also has 4 courses on LinkedIn Learning, or lynda.com if you're more familiar with that platform. And we'll talk about those in a moment. One of his courses actually is in a learning journey where I'm thrilled that one of my courses is also in that learning journey. It's an honor to be included with the likes of Peter as an author. So there's your intro. Peter High. How did you get started? What were your aspirations, and how did you find yourself as a true expert in the field of IT strategy, digital transformation, innovation?
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and thank you for that really nice introduction. I'm certainly going to send that to my mother just to have a good recap there, hopefully make her proud. And actually, speaking of my mother, she is really in many ways the reason that I'm an entrepreneur. My mom is an immigrant from Portugal, and I have this theory, having spoken with so many founders of businesses here in the U.S. who were born elsewhere, that the immigrant's journey is itself fundamentally entrepreneurial. It is taking a risk. It's doing so with optimism and hope that on the other end of that, there is a better outcome, a better life. Going into a place, as my mother did, where the language spoken was not the native language, and overcoming all that to, in fact, have a better life. And so in many ways, he was an inspiration for me in hoping to, at some point, find a spark, find some sort of idea that was uniquely my own, such that I could start my own business. And not unlike yourself, and this may be the first time we mentioned where our paths cross. I decided to go into consulting, initially because I thought of it as a paid education, an opportunity to sharpen my business skills, to learn a number of business, to sharpen my business acumen and my toolkit more generally speaking, and to have exposure to a great number of industries as an education for myself as to where might I put my time and my brain power and energy in starting a business. And as it turned out, it was actually as a service business in the consulting field, as I started to develop some methodologies that were uniquely my own. So when I was 27 in 2001, launched my business, Metis Strategy. And to your question about technology, just to take 1 minute more, I wish I could say that I was prescient and recognized the ascent of that. I mean, my professional career began in 1996, so this is, give or take a couple of years into the digital age, depending upon how you define it. And I had the great fortune of joining a firm, my first couple of firms before founding my own, where chief information officers and tech leaders happened to be the clients, and thus my early network was formed in that field. And I've had the great fortune to continue to advise executives in that field as that discipline has only grown within enterprises. That's
great. So, and can't help but quote Hamilton with "Immigrants, they get the job done." And so there's some interesting intersections and overlaps here, and I'll take that as a segue because one of my favorite immigrants, somebody who moved to the States when she was a young girl, actually worked with you on project teams way back in 2000, roughly, about 2000. And that's how long you and I have known each other, because we worked together 20 years ago. It's hard to believe I'm saying that, 20 years ago. And that young woman who worked on that project with you turned out to end up being my wife.
Yeah.
And so she and says only good things about you and being a manager. That's a whole other show. We'll just cover how much my wife loved working with you. But
vice versa.
What was interesting is that company, the scopes of work that we were exploring at that time were effectively e-business strategy consulting. In a lot of cases, it was helping enterprises figure out how to use the internet. And I was thinking about that as I was watching one of your LinkedIn courses, where you do everyone the favor of just defining basic words because we need the foundation of just knowing what we're talking about in a vocabulary, so we can actually stitch together strategy and productive discussions. The words you define are first digitization, and then digitalization, and then onto what you call true digital transformation. And so I'm going to ask you almost like a speed round to define those. But when you were defining digitization, it really made me think of those earliest days we spent together helping enterprises just understand how to use the internet in sort of its simplest terms. We were teaching them how to digitize. So tell our listeners, what is digitization?
Yeah, thank you. So, and this the definition of this owes greatly to colleagues of mine, Chris Davis and Alex Krauss, who worked a lot in the development of some of these ideas as well. Okay. So, digitization, just as you say, is that early stage, Ian, of businesses rendering what was traditionally done in an analog form into digital form. So, think of it in its simplest form of like taking your products and rendering them in some way, whether it's just the description of what it is that your business does, and really basic aspects of the foundational steps towards, for instance, e-commerce and early stages of developing a digital part of your business. And so that's really kind of, if you think about the maturity and climbing the rugs toward the ultimate goal of digital transformation, which I know we'll get to, really that's the first rung to get to make sure that you're building the appropriate building blocks towards that destination.
Great. And so digitalization, which sometimes I just counsel people not to use, just first of all, because I'm sure they'll spell it wrong. But what is digitalization?
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's a good point. So digitalization is then taking it to the next step. And oftentimes it's in this part of the journey, for instance, where you will have your traditional marketing team and digital marketing. You will have your sales team in digital sales, let's say. You will have, if you're a newspaper, you will have the physical newspaper and then rendering aspects of what you're delivering to customers in a digital form. But they are still separate entities. Marketing and digital marketing, different leaders, perhaps, different teams, different disciplines. And so it begins in the shadows, begins almost as a mirror to the traditional aspect, the traditional fields in the various ways that I've just described, but not yet fully enmeshed, not woven together in a way such that that's kind of the new norm, the further path towards digital transformation.
Perfect. I'm going to throw one in before we get to true digital transformation, just out of curiosity, because it's used a lot, and you use it in some of your courses. What's your view on what constitutes a digital native?
Well, so it's interesting. Great question. There's the individual definition, and then there's the company definition. Right. I use both of those. So the digital native is, someone, I put the roughly like Netscape's IPO in August of 1995 as one of the early stages. One could certainly argue that it's earlier than that, but as perhaps one of the, birth periods of the digital age. So it would mean in some ways, if you as an individual were born, or at least became conscious during that period, such that the internet was already in place, you had an email address as long as you could remember, you were conducting internet searches and so on. You had sort of an online persona or set of experiences from the early stages of your memory. And then likewise for companies, those born since the digital age, those that had access to more modern means of doing business, more modern people practices and skills, processes, tool sets, and so on. Those are then the digital native organizations or enterprises.
Interesting. One of the things that occurred, and I think we've all been exposed to this recently, or a lot of us have, since quarantining, since schools closed and sent people home to learn. It occurred to me there's sort of an evolving skill set that qualifies as digital native. I mean, as you said, my children became conscious when there were iPhones and iPads everywhere and laying on the floor for them to play with and touch. And it was very much that glass interface between themselves and information. And then they ended up at home having to do Zoom calls on a laptop with a keyboard and a mouse pad. Things that they had never done despite having been truly digital native for as long as they've been alive. And so there's almost sort of a retroactive, they had to go back and learn some prior generations' capabilities. But then I also am fascinated because I remember my father always reminding me that we had spent good money on an Encyclopedia Britannica. So why don't I look there to try to find the answer? Because it's up there on the shelf and I never touch it. And I think of that every time my children's natural inclination is to ask Alexa for an answer to something. And it's just, that's really native, that they just know through voice and a smart assistant, they can find usually not very useful answers to things. But I do know how old various teenage singers are from like High School Musical and stuff. So thank you, Alexa, for that. But still. And I don't think that's in the Encyclopedia Britannica. But,
probably not.
Yeah, but you're right. So that's how they access that. Okay, so thank you for indulging me on digital native. So then you get to digital transformation, and my goodness, we've been talking about this for a long time, and I'm convinced a lot of people use it without truly understanding. This is another movie reference. Maybe it feels like it's. Feels like it's Princess Bride. Like, what does that mean? I do not think that means what you think it means. A lot of people use digital transformation. You are an absolute expert and authority on it. What, in your mind, is true digital transformation?
Yeah, so if you take the example of that I gave for digitalization, it is the point at which digital marketing and marketing become one. It's the point at which the physical newspaper and the digital version of that, the parts of the business that bring those together become one. It's truly woven into the fabric of all that you do. It's not a secondary consideration. It's not another part of your organization or feeling like, or perhaps literally a subsidiary of your traditional business. It is actually part of the whole. And so and there are many ways in which that can be better proven, whether that's sources of revenue or percentage of revenue derived from older sources versus digital channels. But I think also part of it is cultural. At what point does the organization recognize that digital is something that is breathing life into the internal operation as well, and therefore coloring and impacting employee experience, while also doing the same for customers as well. Right. And so it's at that point when it's a cultural attribute that I think organizations really have achieved through digital transformation.
That's great. So I have a question to follow up on that. Before I do, want to welcome some folks to the live stream. If you are listening, please share your names now because I'm about to read them. But want to welcome Daniel Soto, Robin from Baltimore, Daniel's from Florida. Thank you, Daniel. Gloria from California, AJ in Indianapolis, Donna in Los Angeles, Joseph in California, Rachel in Florida, Daniel in Poland, Jim, usually not from Tampa, but in Tampa right now. So hello, Jim. Thanks for tuning in. It's enterprises that embrace this, and it's a culture in some cases in their DNA. Does that mean that established enterprises stand a fighting chance? Is there any way for the big blue chips in the world to adopt and transform, or are they just destined to be clobbered by new upstarts that have the ability to start digital?
Yeah, so absolutely. Digital, if the term I like to use as a point of contrast is digital immigrants. So those born before the digital age, but have crossed the chasm into the digital age and need to rethink the way in which they do business in order to better compete. Truth be told, as your question suggests, Ian, those organizations born in the digital age certainly have a number of advantages, whether it's the tabula rasa, the blank slate that available to them to define people practices, processes, tool sets, technologies, modern in all cases. There's no one builds in 1960s or 70s or 80s technology to a business born in the teens or the 2020s. That they will use what is available to them now to make sure that they are building something that is modern and hopefully scalable and updatable, upgradable, and to the extent possible, it's never fully possible, but is as future-proof as possible.
Right.
Now, we need to remember that those older businesses have tremendous advantages of experience, of data, of existing customer sets, of a great number of people who are contributing to an innovation agenda, let's say, if organized appropriately. So there's often this kind of woe is me for the larger, older organizations, but it's also important to recognize they have a lot of advantages as well. The key is, and this is actually the topic you were kind to mention my first two books. I'm in the throes of writing my third one. The topic, the title is Getting to Nimble. And the idea is organizations need to focus on enterprise nimbleness. They need to develop people practices to enable organizational agility so that people are learning the skills for tomorrow, not resting on the laurels of the skills that they've learned at university or in the early stages of their career, that they're using modern practices and processes to make sure that ideas are, reach the light of day faster and impact customers more readily, that they're using technologies that are themselves more variabilized in their cost structure, more scalable and reliable, of course, secure, a big implication these days, unfortunately, what will be for some time, no doubt. And if they get those things right, they can parlay the tremendous advantages of experience while ensuring they're also building an organization that can shift readily as they and seize opportunities as they present themselves, while also staving off issues as those arise as well. I'll tell you, if you don't mind my indulging you with a quick story, Ian.
Please.
The title of my book came from a conversation I had with the CIO of CarMax, Shamim Mohammed. And at the end of my podcast, I often ask the question, what trends excite you as you look, let's say, 3 or 5 years into the future? And he had a few different answers to that. As I recall, AI and blockchain were a couple of things with some good answers as to how you might use those. But then he concluded by saying, that said, if the time horizon is 3 years, let's say, the thing that might be and I'm paraphrasing him, but the thing that might be number one on that list, you and I may not be able to name today, such as the pace of change in business. And so organizational nimbleness becomes that much more important. It's less sort of your ability to see that there are trends that are arising and more your ability to seize them once you recognize that they have some kind of benefit back to your organization.
Right. No, that's tremendous. So let's pivot, building on nimbleness. And you also mentioned agility. And we talked about this before we went live. COVID is going to be sort of the asterisk in every history book and studying how businesses have transformed or simply just survived. Digital transformation pre versus post COVID, I feel like it's going to take on a different flavor and a different intensity, some out of just pure necessity. I'm hearing a lot in the discussions that I'm having with people about this concept of acceleration. That everything has had to be accelerated, that any sort of digital transformation they were doing beforehand has really gotten a kick in the pants to speed up now. And then specific examples like telehealth and telemedicine. And if you can't go into a facility to go see someone face to face, you still have to have healthcare. So telehealth, telemedicine has accelerated. We've certainly accelerated our ability to enable and experience remote working and virtual working and work at home. And so I guess in that sort of linear order, do you think a digital transformation pre-COVID has a different characteristic than what will take shape post-COVID? And it sounds like, based on the book you're working on, that sort of nimbleness and acceleration and agility is going to be really critical, table stakes to survive in that dynamic new world.
That's right. Well, I mean, when you look at the great brands that have fallen by the wayside, or at least have entered Chapter 11, and Neiman Marcus and J. Crew, to name two prominent examples. Think about the great companies. I mean, certainly there's some structural issues with the hospitality space or the airlines or restaurant industry writ large. That even if you have gone through a solid digital transformation, that it's going to be very difficult, obviously, for you to, until there's a definitive recovery, to fully recover the business that's been lost. But in so many industries, the difference between leader and laggard right now, the difference in the level of resilience, has to do with how long ago and how readily, how far they had gotten, these businesses had gotten in those transformations. We see those organizations that are able to pivot in the various ways that you've described creatively, to seize opportunities as a result of one door being closed on a source of revenue or a means of interacting with customers, but identifying additional doors to open because of new pathways to revenue that were established prior to the crisis. And so, one of the wonderful things, I did a piece a couple weeks ago for Forbes, where I was, in essence, speculating what this would have looked like if the 2008 Great Recession had also included the pandemic, sending all of us to our homes. And it would have been completely different. Number one, there were still a lot of IT organizations that didn't, or should say enterprises that didn't view IT as strategic, not nearly as much as thankfully now. Also, there was just not the many advances that have happened in the past 12 years, making so many companies, so many organizations now refer to themselves as a technology company in the fill in the blank industry, airline, finance, hospitality, retail, et cetera. And the implications of that is it has become so much more strategic. The digital and technology leaders have a much greater source of influence, as I mentioned earlier, on employee experience and customer experience, on new sources of revenue and new products, et cetera. Yeah. And I think because there has been a real difference for those who had transformed successfully as to how well they've sustained themselves, and I hasten to add, Ian, that I think there's going to be an even greater exit velocity for those very companies once we definitively get on a much better footing economically, as which of course will be tied to the health crisis subsiding as well. Right. That the appetite for greater digital transformation for those who make it through is going to increase tremendously because I think that has been such an important ingredient to determine who's done reasonably well, all things considered, who's done very well, and those either that are lagging, and of course those that may fall by the wayside.
Right. Have you seen, and mentioned in the beginning, you've been speaking to CIOs and technology leaders, but leaders in general for your career, and in your podcast format in Technovation, we talked before the show, you're up to episode 460 or something, which is extraordinary. And I marvel at the sheer amount of work and tenacity and consistency to get there. But that aside, you've effectively put together a resource that is a historical document as to the priorities of the CIOs of enterprises over the last few years. Have you seen could you go back and track and see those discussions you were having in episodes 1 through 50 that are the sort of the nuance and the example that then set them up to survive and thrive, as you just stated, for episodes 450 to 500? Yeah. What is it about a CIO or an enterprise that makes them invest the right way and think strategically about how they deploy IT?
Yeah, great question. And again, by luck, the podcast was started in November of 2008. And so it was actually in the throes of the last economic crisis that we began this podcast. So it really does chart this period between the two, as of now, the two economic crises. Yeah. And it is really a stark contrast, Ian. Way back when, thankfully, the people I was interviewing, as I was, of course, I had liberty in selecting who those people were not representative of this. But this was still a time when a lot of IT departments, a lot of companies rather, were adhering to Nicholas Parr's question, does IT matter, as he put it in Harvard Business Review? And a lot of companies, the answer was no. And so they were, shedding IT talent. They were de-emphasizing IT, but there was this cadre of elite CIOs who recognized this remarkable strategic perch within the corporate structure that they had, a source of insight, a source of influence, the growing prominence that was really began about the same time with the introduction of the iPhone, for instance. And all of a sudden, the consumerization of IT, such that you didn't need to be an engineer or a computer scientist to have a deep resonance and even an understanding, at least at a very, at a basic level, and increasingly at a deeper and deeper level of technology and its power. Those executives recognized they were reaching this moment that was a true point of change, and also realized that their ability to influence where their companies were going in order to seize these very opportunities that we've been talking about so far in the conversation, that these were important. This was an important inflection point that they needed to be sure the rest of the organization was cognizant of. So whereas it was, I think, an elite band of CIOs in 2008, thankfully it's a much broader set of people that have that understanding and have these wonderful stories to tell of the value that they have driven within their organizations circa 2020.
Okay. And you've got, it seems, a growing list of discussions with individuals on your podcast about CIO to CEO, and how several of them become, I would imagine that there's some overlap to that elite cadre of CIOs that are being seen and handpicked to now lead their organizations because they had the vision to position them as well as they did over the last few years.
That's right. And gosh, again, back in 2008, to use that as a starting point to that, for many, it would seem absurd then that a CIO could eventually become a CEO of a company. Such was the thought among so many executives that IT was this support organization as opposed to a true strategic weapon within the arsenal of the company. So many CIOs still reporting to CFOs as opposed to CEOs. And gosh, what's your pathway to CEO if you're not even reporting to one? Thankfully, so much has changed, and you're exactly right, especially in those areas, although certainly not limited to it. As enterprise technology grows and venture funding of enterprise-backed companies have grown, the opportunities for really business-savvy, customer-centric, revenue-driving CIOs to take on positions, even found businesses. I know a number of CIOs who've done that, or take over businesses because of their their deep understanding of the needs of CIOs, having had that role for a time, while having a broader aperture to their makeup. Yeah. It's really a killer combination, and especially as you think again about the rising strategic importance within organizations of technology. Who better than the former CIO, so long as they're oriented correctly to take on that leadership post. I think that's going to be we'll see that happen to a much greater extent as the years go on.
That's great. And you mentioned, you introduced yourself in some of the LinkedIn Learning courses as Metis Strategy works within that intersection between business and technology. And it seems like that disconnect has created rifts and sort of hiccups in adoption of technology. Speaking personally, I watched the RPA space really be a mechanism for business to avoid working with IT and digitizing and emulating staff and processes and people with technology that they thought they could do on their own. Obviously, anyone who went it alone often ended up stubbing their toes and running into the fact that this is more difficult than they thought, and in those transformations didn't work. So it really is that intersection, but then the knowledge and, as you say, the sort of the awareness and sensitivity to what makes up the full story of transformation, that it's not just a fascination with technology, but it is good process, great people, skills, culture change enabled by strong technology.
Very well said.
The adoption of cloud technologies was fits and spurt. You found it, and enterprises that were often, from my experience, they were adapting from sort of the edges in. They would go to a cloud time and expense system, but they wouldn't ever dream of having a cloud-based ERP or CRM system. And then COVID, and I saw work having to migrate home en masse, right, to survive, to continue to serve clients, but also to continue to protect livelihoods of staff. And so it was the cloud, it was the nimble, it was the more modern, it was the cloud-enabled enterprises that were able to really quickly pivot, or they didn't need to pivot at all. They were just there. Do you think post-COVID digital transformation, some of the traditional discussions about the integrity or the security or the ease or et cetera of cloud technologies, are we done with that? Is that behind us just because we see how valuable it is?
I like to believe that that's the case, Ian. It's hard to imagine an executive not recognizing the power of technology. And again, I think the extent to which it's going to be one of several things, but a very critical one that will determine which organizations make it through with the least bruises through this crisis, I think it's going to push a lot of people to emulate the great work done by technology leaders, digital leaders within those organizations. So I really do like to think that we've reached a point where there's this confluence of factors, many of which we've discussed, that are indelible marks, I believe, on the business landscape, and likely means that the demand by enterprises in having a very strategic person running digital, running technology for their enterprise, while also giving them the liberty to fully blossom in that role and drive unusual value from that post. And then seeing more organizations, I think, truly realize that value is going to just, I think, increase. It'll be a virtuous cycle towards a greater level of demand from that perspective as well.
Super. Want to wrap up, conscious of your time, but before I ask my final question, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about your perspective on the broad and sometimes confusing AI topic, and how enterprises make sense of AI as a tool or just an aspiration. Do you find yourself in those discussions, and how do you help leadership through sort of their own examination of the application of sort of the aspirational?
Yeah. Well, I think, artificial intelligence is part of a continuum that, in recent memory, and it goes much further back. I don't have the full history, but, if you think about business intelligence, and then you think about data, and actually even before that, sort of statistics, you have departments and people who are statisticians within organizations. As I say, the development of business intelligence, data analytics, then moving on to disciplines like machine learning and artificial intelligence. In many ways, there's kind of a thread that's pulled throughout that is increasing or raising the bar at which humans need to interact with information in order to draw insight and make decisions. If you think about even you and I are not so old, but if we think back to when you and I began our careers, even then there was a tremendous amount that was done in a fairly manual form of tremendous importance in terms of data analysis, data synthesis. And artificial intelligence really is in some ways the fullest realization of that concept of taking enormous amounts of data, having the algorithms behind the artificial intelligence parse through that. This is just one application. There are so many of them, of course, such that you can take what once took an army of people, and in fact, even that army of people can't compete, and have a better means to make decisions more readily that will impact the success or lack thereof of your business. Right. And so everyone needs to have, at a minimum, even beyond dipping your toe in the water and actually making some commitments in this area. The challenge, of course, is finding the talent to do so, building the discipline, the processes, the tooling, and so on. Thankfully, all of those are becoming a bit easier as there are more people that are getting appropriate training in disciplines related to artificial intelligence. There's more open source tools available that can be leveraged. There are more partners in the world who can also facilitate that as people embark on that journey. But I mean, there's no doubt that's going to be a trend that will continue to rise, and it will be among those that determine, for those who get involved earlier and make a commitment more firmly, who will win and who won't as time passes.
Well put. Okay, so I promised I'd get you back to your day. I will leave you. I will turn the tables because I can. In one of your courses, you do state effectively for the future, the best companies look forward and chart bold new paths. So, Peter High, I ask you, what trends excite you in all of your discussions with the world's leading CIOs, in your writings and your teachings, and the answers that they've provided you, and in light of this post-COVID, transformation 2.0 set of imperatives? What are you excited about? What are you watching? And what should I be watching and reading and learning more about?
I appreciate that, Ian. Thank you. So I would say this concept, I referenced it before, but learning agility is, I think, a trend that is of particular importance. Our ability to adapt, our ability to be nimble is, I think, going to become, we as individuals and as companies will be, again, that determinant of who succeeds and who doesn't as we go forward. And so creating learning cultures such that people do have that we are hiring for people that have that drive to learn the skills of tomorrow and bring that back into their day jobs, such that we are constantly modernizing our organizations so that we are not, again, resting on the laurels of the successes of years past, but building the new successes, the new products and services for the future. I would also say one of the things that I'm really excited about is so many trends point towards greater collaboration at unusual intersections. They're not so unusual anymore, but I think they will deepen. So, since the beginning of business, the development of these silos based upon specific skill sets that one is hired into at the outset of one's career. Typically, the pathway up is you were hired into marketing as a junior person in the marketing department, and you started climbing that ladder. And if you're really good, you eventually become a chief marketing officer. But the best organizations are the ones that have at least permeable filters to those silos, if not taking down at least some aspects of them. I'm not saying, of course, that you won't have those divisions within the organization. But those that figure out ways to spread people across the business, to have a literal or figurative year abroad in a different discipline or a different country, in order to draw greater levels of insight as to how value is created, how customers value from the perspective and improvements in terms of customer experience can happen as well. So I think you think of topics like Agile, DevOps, the productization of IT, all of these, what's behind them is greater levels of collaboration such that organizations have many more trips to the plate in terms of trying out new things. Yes. And that really, I think, is the recipe towards successful innovation and ultimately great and, as best as possible, sustainable success for the long term.
That's great. I love the concept of sort of an enterprise junior year abroad. That's That's fun.
Yeah.
I'm spent time in Europe, eating my way through Europe. So I just equate that to, I don't know.
An excuse to do that again.
Right, exactly. It's beer steins and digital. I feel like there's an intersection there somewhere.
Right.
No, that's spectacular. Peter, thank you so much. As I said at the beginning, there's nobody in the world who knows better and has reached out and spoken to and advised and learned from the world's experts on digital transformation than you. We will share links to the books. Please let us know when the forthcoming book on nimbleness comes out, because we will absolutely have to get back and talk about that. I'd love to have you back on the show to explore that one. And then we'll also share links to Technovation, the podcast, and to your Forbes column, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to get going. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks everybody for joining us from around the world. Really excited to have you join me for yet another OneTAKE Live. And again, hope everyone's healthy, safe, and sound. And I will speak to you again soon.